Okay. Kia ora koutou katoa and warm Pacific greetings. My name, in case you don't know, in case you haven't met me, is Leckie, and I'm conjointly with University of Newcastle in Australia and Victoria University of Wellington. And the reason that I'm introducing our speaker today is because I'm one of the old timers of the Pacific History Association, but there are some here who are even older than me, who remain nameless. I'd just like to point out that, as Helen Gardner said, that this session will be recorded, and we will be posting it up at a later date, a link to the YouTube video, which will be on the Pacific History webpage and the Pacific History Facebook page. Now, before I introduce our speaker, because I may not be finishing the talk today, so I just wanted to make a few comments. This is our last webinar that the Pacific History Association is holding for 2020. And we hope that it is the last one, because we hope that next year everybody is able to communicate and buzz around a lot more in person. But we don't know what next year will bring, so we may return to having the webinar series next year, but perhaps on a more intimate basis. Today we've got 100 people signed up for this seminar. That at the moment we haven't got 100 online, but clearly that's going to be too many, I think, if we're going to have interactive webinars, PHA webinars in the future, but we'll keep you informed about that. So today I'm really delighted to introduce Emma Kluge, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Sydney, although she's not actually in Sydney at the moment. And Emma is in the final stages of her PhD on decolonisation, interrupted the West Papuan campaign for independence and the United Nations in the 1960s. Emma has already worked as a junior research fellow with the Laureate for International History. And I think what she's bringing to her research, which is particularly special, is that she's looking at a highly topical regional issue, decolonisation in Western Papua, but she's also placing this in the international context. And so we're really getting here a lovely nexus of regional and global issues. We started off in our webinar series with a team from the University of the South Pacific, and they were looking at really very detailed Indigenous Fijian history. And now we're able to move into something that's looking at something that is much more on the sort of global stage. Emma also recently published an article with the International History Review on her topic of decolonisation. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of Emma in the future. So without further ado, I'd just like to hand you over to Helen. She is the person at the control centre in Melbourne, and she's going to give us some housekeeping details. So I'm really looking forward to hearing this seminar. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jackie. Now, if, as promised, about 100 people turn up for this webinar, it will be too many for people to ask individual questions. Now, so we might make a decision after Emma's finished her talk whether in fact people can unmute themselves or I can unmute them and you can ask questions, or if there's too many people, it's probably over about 40 or to 50, then I will ask you to please ask your questions through the chat function because we won't be able to manage it otherwise. So thank you everybody for turning up, and I'm going to throw over to Emma now. Emma, did you want me to put Spotlight on, or you sorted that out?
I can do that.
Thank you. I will mute you all, so Emma can make sure she can go ahead without interruption. Thank you everybody, and welcome Emma.
Thank you. And I'll unmute myself. And I'll just get my PowerPoint up. Okay, cool. Yeah, so thank you, Jackie and Helen, for your introductions, and thank you for the work you've done to organise this session, and thank you everyone for coming. It's lovely to see so many familiar faces in this time of often isolation and disconnection. So yeah, as Jackie mentioned, I'm a PhD student. I'm currently in the very last week of my PhD, so if I seem a little dazed today, that is why. And I'm speaking today from my parents' home in Adelaide, on the lands of the Gardner people, where I've been living since the beginning of the pandemic. And I would just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So thank you for joining me from across the Pacific. And I also want to acknowledge any West Papuans or West Papuan activists joining us today, and the ongoing struggle for West Papuan independence. I thank you for letting me share in this history and in your struggle. So as the slide says, my thesis traces the West Papuan campaign for independence across the 1960s, from the beginnings of West Papuan nationalism in the territory through to a transnational and diasporic activist network. And I've labelled this talk after my PhD because I don't really have any ideas left at the moment. So the name is quite broad, but as you'll see, I'm going to focus on just an aspect of that work today. But I'd love more than happy to answer questions about my thesis more generally in the question time. So I explore primarily West Papuan activist networks that formed across West Papua, Papua New Guinea and the Netherlands. So my guess, partly because I know some of you and also because many of you are Pacific historians, is that you're familiar with the history of West Papua. But I always like to start with a quick overview just to make sure we're all on the same page and to kind of set the frame for the talk. So as you can see on screen, there's a map of New Guinea. And so when I talk about West Papua, I'm referring to the territory that occupies the western half of the island of New Guinea. West Papua has been given many names over the years: Netherlands New Guinea, West New Guinea, West Irian and Irian Jaya. But I use West Papua because it's the name used by West Papuan nationalists, both today and during the period that I study. So during the 1950s, West Papua was under Dutch colonial control. And after the loss of its Indonesian empire, the Dutch turned their focus to the territory and began to facilitate a process of decolonisation to make West Papua an independent territory. West Papuan leaders took this opportunity to launch their own campaign for independence in the 1960s, and this process was then interrupted by Indonesia, who claimed the territory belonged within the Republic. In 1962, they leveraged Cold War politics to gain US support and then forced the Netherlands into negotiations, which resulted in territory being transferred from Netherlands to Indonesian control. West Papua was finally incorporated into the Indonesian Republic in 1969 after the so-called Act of Free Choice. While this vote was meant to allow for West Papuan population to choose whether or not to remain part of Indonesia, the representatives were handpicked by the Indonesian government and the process tightly controlled so that only one outcome was allowed: the incorporation of West Papua into the Indonesian Republic. The sovereignty of the territory is still contested to this day, with many activists arguing that the West Papuan people should have the right to an internationally supervised referendum, where, unlike in the Act of Free Choice, the people are actually given the opportunity to vote on the future of the territory. So in the 1960s, and the history of West Papua in the 1960s are referenced kind of in popular histories or articles on the territory. Usually 3 moments are highlighted: the West Papuan flag raising ceremonies in December 1961, the New York Agreement signing between the Netherlands and Indonesia in 1962, and the Act of Free Choice, which took place across 1969. Arguments are mobilized about the legitimacy of these moments and the agreements and their comparative significance to the modern conflict. However, there is a risk that focusing on these moments can erase all that occurs in between them, or that the history of the 1960s is interpreted only through the lens of trying to argue against the legitimacy of the Act of Free Choice. This framing also sets the New York Agreement up as something that supersedes West Papuan sovereignty and as the arbiter of West Papuan rights, and in doing so further legitimizes UN or Indonesian control. A focus on these moments also tends to marginalize West Papuan voices. While the West Papuan nationalists were the instigators in the flag raising ceremonies, they were marginalized at both the signing of the agreement and during the Act of Free Choice. And so dissecting the documents around these often involves focusing a lot on UN, Indonesia, or the Netherlands. So what would it look like to study the 1960s instead through the lens of West Papuan people? How does this change the picture that it creates? So the focus, my focus on my thesis is on the 1960s, but rather than assessing the legitimacy of Indonesian control, the New York Agreement or the Act of Free Choice, I wanted to focus on the development of the West Papuan Campaign for Independence, looking at how a small nationalist movement was transformed into a transnational campaign for independence. In the same way we learn about the platforms of Nelson Mandela or the NAACP, I wanted to explore how the West Papuan independence movement developed the language and their strategies. How did they frame their struggle? What were the strategies of the movement? And in my thesis, the New York Agreement and the Act of Free Choice is significant, but only in relation to West Papuans' case for West Papuan independence and how they use these different agreements and the Act of Free Choice as part of a strategy to gain independence. So the reason I'm so interested in the ideas of the West Papuan Campaign for Independence is perhaps because I was introduced to West Papua in a rather unusual way. Instead of learning about the West Papuan struggle through the activist campaign, I was introduced to the struggle here in the National Archives of Australia in Canberra during my honours year in 2015. I was interested in studying Australia's refugee history, and one of the books I was reading mentioned West Papuan refugees who sought refuge in Papua New Guinea while it was under Australian colonial control. When I began my honours thesis, I knew nothing about West Papua. I couldn't even point it out on a map. Yet as I followed the stories of West Papuan refugees, I was introduced to the West Papuan Campaign for Independence. In their applications for asylum in Papua New Guinea, West Papuan refugees would be given the opportunity to make a personal statement that would be included in their application. One of the personal statements I first read was from Daniel Kadam, who sought refuge in Papua New Guinea in 1969. And I want to read it for you to bring you into that moment. So the statement reads, I decided to withdraw with my family to the territory of Papua and New Guinea. Reasons. All political figures and organisations have had consultations to ask the Indonesian government to give and guarantee freedom of political action, party activity and assembly. But after this was heard, leaked, there were wild arrests, killings, shootings put into action by the Indonesian armed forces, suffering in and out of prison and property looted and stolen by the Indonesian army, for me personally and for comrades in arms. 30,000 West Papuans, ordinary people, have been casualties. 1963 until 1969 has become a matter for us all. Kadam's statement and his file recorded his experiences in West Papua over the 1960s. He was imprisoned by the Indonesian military and sought refuge because he feared Indonesian retaliation as a result of his involvement with the West Papuan resistance movement, the OPM. Reading the personal statements of West Papuans like Kadam, I was brought into their struggle for independence. Little did I know that these files would begin a journey that was both political and personal for me. As the West Papuans described their suffering under Indonesian colonialism, and their desires for the future of West Papua. I became interested in their story and in their struggle. Why was West Papua handed from one colonial power to another? Why were West Papuans denied a voice in the future of their territory? Why weren't they free to choose their future and to live on the land of their ancestors? Their words radicalized me and changed the direction of my professional life. So after my honours year, I wanted to know more about West Papua. So I decided to continue on to do a PhD so I could dig deeper into the West Papuan campaign. I found some great histories of West Papua and learnt more about the modern movement for West Papuan independence. And I was particularly interested in their campaign to the United Nations, since this was an ongoing strategy of West Papuan activists. Yet I was frustrated with how academic histories of West Papua to the UN in the 1960s tended to sideline West Papuan voices. West Papuan actors were there, but they were often the objects of debate, not the subjects. The West Papuan campaign to the United Nations was mentioned, but no one went into much detail about their perspective or ideas. So often the West Papuans were mentioned only in relation to the Netherlands or Indonesia, or the resistance movement was used as background or counter-narrative to the United Nations mission. I knew the West Papuan campaign to the United Nations, so I went searching for more direct access to their campaign at the UN archives in New York. To my surprise, I found files literally labelled petitions, which contain hundreds of letters written by West Papuans during the 1960s. These files are in the footnotes of other accounts, but only mentioned in passing. In these petitions, a whole world of West Papuan ideas opened up to me, ideas that both fleshed out and challenged dominant historical narratives about West Papua in the 1960s. These West Papuan petitions formed the basis of my PhD investigation into the West Papuan campaign at the United Nations. And it would be an intellectual and political history of this West Papuan independence movement. Yet using the UN archives came with its own challenges and raised many questions for me methodologically. What did it mean to study the West Papuan campaign for independence using the archives of the United Nations? How would this influence the story that was told and the perspectives that were represented? The United Nations organizations was central in facilitating the transfer of West Papua from the United Nations to Indonesia and allowed for the West Papuan right to self-determination to be denied during the Act of Free Choice. Surely this would influence the picture that the West Papuan archives presented, both of the West Papuan campaign and the situation it presented. Additionally, the UN archives are almost overwhelming in their detail about West Papua in the 1960s. The issue of West Papua was debated at the UN General Assembly over the 1950s and 60s. The New York Agreement was negotiated by the United Nations, and under the New York Agreement, the United Nations was required both to administer the territory for a short period under the United Nations Temporary Executive Authority, and then return and observe the Act of Free Choice. So there were pages and pages of reports from the United Nations Temporary Executive Authority and UN representatives who went to West Papua over the year, as well as all the paperwork that comes through this kind of international agreement forming and decision making. These detailed records were hard to resist, especially when still only a few studies exist making significant use of them, such as John Saltford's United Nations and Indonesian takeover of West Papua. The UN archives provided a compelling counter-narrative of the 1960s, drawing me into the logic of the UN and along a path already well-trodden, assessing the significance of the UN and the validity of the New York Agreement and the Act of Free Choice in determining the future of West Papua. If you were to go through all the previous drafts of my thesis, you would see many versions of it where I got sidetracked by these archives. Long passages on the debates between the Netherlands and Indonesia at the United Nations, pages dissecting the effectiveness of the United Nations Temporary Executive Authority, and long expositions on the UN's role in overseeing Indonesia's miscarriage of justice in the lead up to the Act of Free Choice. Yet this was not the history that I was trying to follow, and not how I wanted to contextualize the petitions of the West Papuans. So to resist this logic, I drew deeper into the experiences of West Papuan individuals. and communities, and returned to tracing the development of the West Papuan Campaign for Independence. In doing so, I sat West Papuan voices and tried to turn down the volume on the perspectives of the United Nations, the Netherlands, and Indonesia in the 1960s. So in order to study the West Papuan Campaign for Independence to the United Nations from a West Papuan perspective, I needed to reconstitute a West Papuan archive. I collected this archive by following the lives of West Papuans to Papua New Guinea, the Netherlands, and the United Nations. Here, I returned to the case files of West Papuan refugees in Papua New Guinea. I conducted oral history interviews with the descendants of West Papuan activists in Papua New Guinea and the Netherlands, and sought out sources written by West Papuans and collected the quotes of West Papuans in other scholarly accounts. This journey took me all around the world and was only facilitated by the privileged access to resources that I enjoyed as an Australian scholar at a well-funded university, and I definitely don't take this for granted. Getting to know different communities of West Papuan activists was particularly important to me to help understand the significance of this period and how to frame the West Papuan campaign in the 1960s. I was lucky to get to conduct interviews with some of the descendants of the West Papuan activists who wrote petitions to the UN in the 1960s. Through these interviews, I got a sense of the lives of West Papuan activists, their motivation, and their ongoing legacies in their communities. While most of the people I talked to are not directly quoted in my thesis, their contributions shaped the tone, the pace, and the framing of the historical narrative, which I aim to reflect the perspective of West Papuan activists and their ancestors. So what does this West Papuan archive tell us about the West Papuan Campaign for Independence in the 1960s? So while the West Papuan Campaign for Independence was conducted at the United Nations by activists based all around the world, it was formed out of the West Papuan nationalist movement that was established in the territory in the 1950s and early 1960s. Leaders involved in the West Papuan nationalist campaign during this period then became the West Papuan activists in exile. They were those who were part of the New Guinea Council, the Papuan National Committee, and often Papuan politicians during the 1960s. Leaders involved, the platform they expressed in 1961 was developed and transformed into an international campaign after the signing of the New York Agreement. So while there was this continuity, there were also discontinuities. Now the movement was fractured across West Papua, Papua New Guinea, and the Netherlands, meaning West Papuan activists had to develop transnational networks to continue their campaign. Each of these communities had different leaders and played unique roles in the struggle from 1962 to 69. And I just want to spend a little bit of time going over those communities. So probably one of the most well-known in the campaign to the United Nations is the Netherlands diaspora. And these West Papuan communities, based primarily in Delft, formed after the New York Agreement was signed in 1962, and were made up initially of high-profile West Papuan civil servants and politicians. The key leaders of the West Papuan independence movement in the Netherlands were Marcus Kashaipo and Nicholas Yahweh, and both men took up Dutch residence in order to continue campaigning. While they'd worked together in West Papua, they both had quite strong personalities, and some differences of opinions led them to go separate ways in the Netherlands. Yahweh formed the Freedom Committee of West New Guinea, West Papua, while Kashaipo formed the High Court of the Chamber of Representatives of West Papua, West Melanesia. Both groups drew on similar networks across West Papua and Papua New Guinea through a kind of peak body called the Papuan National Front. The Freedom Committee also established satellites in Japan through Herman Wonsiwa and in Senegal through Ben Tengakma. Both groups also set up temporary offices at the UN in New York. The Netherlands activists focus on translating West Papuans' local experiences into a campaign targeted at the UN, United Nations, and UN delegates. The Netherlands diaspora were the most mobile and had the most political freedoms, and so they were kind of able to adjust their campaign depending on what was happening. One of the key outputs of this Netherlands diaspora were their petitions. And so you can see on screen a petition from Nicholas Yahweh. And in their petitions, they conveyed on reports from West Papua gathered by those in the territory in Papua New Guinea, and framed them in relation to both the United Nations documents, so the New York Agreement, the UN Charter, and the Decolonisation Declaration, but also just through appeals to human rights. And yet they also talked about this as a racial struggle. So talking about West Papuans' discrimination on the basis of their race, and establishing their campaign for independence on the basis that they were a distinct people that deserved a distinct nation. So the Papua New Guinea diaspora was initially made up of West Papuan medical students who sought refuge to stay in Papua New Guinea after the New York Agreement was signed. They'd been studying there as part of the Dutch-Australian coordinated training programs, and feared that if they returned, they would be targets of the Indonesian regime on the basis of their education and their political freedoms. These medical students were then joined by other former civil servants who crossed over the border and were sponsored by the Dutch government and given pensions in Papua New Guinea. These former civil servants were often targets of the Indonesian administration and sought refuge on the basis of their support of West Papuan nationalism. The key leaders in Papua New Guinea were Benedictus Sawam, Eli Margin, Makora Hindem, Eliza Hamadi, and Benedictus Belegaze. In Papua New Guinea, they formed a branch of the Papua National Front, which, as I said, this kind of seems to be a peak body for different Papuan activists and organizations that was formed before the signing of the New York Agreement as a way of continuing to advocate for independence and draw attention to West Papua. The Papua New Guinean diaspora provided information to the Netherlands activists, often over the phone or through sending messages along with missionaries or foreign diplomats. And they would often get information from West Papua through the border crossers who would cross over into Wutong. And anyone who sought refuge in Papua New Guinea often came carrying documents or information about what was happening there. The Papua New Guinean diaspora increased after 1964 due to a shift in Australian government policy. Prior to this time, only West Papuans who had worked in the Dutch administration and were sponsored by the Dutch government were granted permissive residence. But after 1964, the Australian government shifted to allowing West Papuans to make a case for political persecution on the basis of their political activities. And so this is where we get those rich personal statements as West Papuans kind of narrated their history of political activity and why they feared Indonesian government retaliation. The Papua New Guinean diaspora campaigned against the Indonesian regime and also petitioned the Australian administration for better conditions for West Papuan refugees. They were more restricted in their movements than the Netherlands diaspora and certainly less well-funded, yet they were still able to speak against the Indonesian administration, and because of their closer proximity to West Papua, able to more directly help West Papuans in the territory. And of course, there's the West Papuan activists in the territory. So as I've already mentioned, there's the Papuan National Front, which while it's hard to trace the networks of this movement, seems to have been coordinated by Nicholas Tenggatwa, who was part of the West New Guinea Council and continued to serve in the administration under Indonesia, while covertly coordinating West Papuan networks and the gathering of intelligence and passing it along to West Papua and the Netherlands activists. Also active in the territory particularly from 1965 was the OPM, the Organisasi Papua Merdeka, or Free Papua movement. And the OPM conducted both military and political resistance. So they did engage in petitioning, but they also engaged in uprisings. And yeah, kind of their aim was to resist Indonesian military incursions into West Papua. West Papuans in the territory were the most restricted and the least able to coordinate across the territory or consistently be involved in the movement, because often they would have to go underground or kind of lay low in order to avoid Indonesian attention. West Papuan activists often use the border as a place of refuge and would sometimes seek assistance from border communities or deliver messages across to Papua New Guinea. So the main strategies of the transnational West Papuan campaign during the 1960s after the New York Agreement were record keeping, awareness raising, and petitioning. So as I've mentioned before, they continued to appeal for West Papuan independence on the basis of the rights laid out in the New York Agreement, the UN Charter, and the 1960 Decolonisation Declaration. And so using these international documents, they appealed to their rights to self-determination, to human rights, but using this to make a claim for independence. These documents can be interpreted in kind of competing ways. And so the West Papuans combined this with the kind of appeals to race and racial solidarity and the uniqueness of Papuan people to make a specific case for West Papuan independence, which was designed to kind of counteract Indonesian arguments that you could interpret these documents to actually support Indonesian incorporation of West Papua. The transnational campaign often shifted in response to local conditions. So after Indonesia left the United Nations in January 1965, West Papuan activists focused on record keeping and reporting information to the UN, since they no longer had access to the territory. Although from 1963, it was pretty hard for information to get out of the territory, and Indonesia had banned foreign journalists. There had been a level of information that got out through the UN's presence in Jakarta and different foreign diplomats. Once Indonesia rejoined the UN in 1966 and announced it would conduct an act of self-determination, the campaign focused on addressing issues in the territories that needed to be reconciled to prepare for the act. So West Papuan activists drew attention to the political prisoners, the suppression of political rights, the need to tell the difference between West Papuan migrants and Indonesian trans migrants, and began again kind of trying to remind the international community of their right to self-determination, and of also kind of counteracting Indonesian arguments that the West Papuan people were not developed enough to participate directly in a vote. So West Papuan activists often pointed to the elections for the New Guinea Council in the 1961, which involved kind of a mixed method of voting where developed West Papuans would vote directly and those in the maybe more regional areas would indirectly vote, as a way of kind of arguing against Indonesia's methods of the act of free choice. When the United Nations returned to West Papua in 1968 to oversee the preparations of the act of free choice, both local and diasporic activists intensified their campaign, hoping that with the UN in the territory able to see what Indonesia was doing, they would be able to get their voices heard, and the UN would be able to make sure that they were able to vote, and that the act of self-determination would lead to independence. So diasporic activists appealed to UN delegates in New York, cultivating their African contacts and also writing to the UN Secretariat to make sure that the UN representative in West Papua was doing his job and overseeing a fair and just process, while local activists delivered petitions to UN offices in West Papua and sometimes Jakarta, this time was kind of unprecedented in local activists' access to the UN. And so we've got these amazing petitions from these local activists during this time who maybe wouldn't have been able to post them to New York. In the territory, West Papuan activists also staged demonstrations and uprisings. So kind of having their voices heard through these kind of peaceful or nonviolent protests, as well as actively resisting Indonesian military's attempts at suppression. So how does a focus on the networks and strategies of the West Papuan independence movement change the way we think about the 1960s? And so I want to give an example by focusing on the year of 1969. So traditionally, in accounts of the history of 1969, the preparations for and the implementation of the Act of Free Choice dominates. The voting in the Act of Free Choice is the main event, and West Papuan resistance is depicted in opposition to these ceremonies or occurring at the fringes of the official proceedings. However, as I've mentioned, the West Papuans are largely excluded from these ceremonies, and those who got to vote in the Act of Free Choice represent only a small proportion of society and mostly those who are pro-Indonesian or coerced into expressing this belief. If 1969 is viewed instead through the lens of West Papuan networks and strategies, it can be seen instead as a pinnacle of the West Papuan nationalist campaign for independence. It's in this year that the campaigns of activists all around the world reached their high point, all focused around West Papuan self-determination leading to independence. Local activists who were continually sidelined by the UN team and had their claims denied, staged a series of uprisings, including the April 11th demonstrations in Jayapura, which coincided with the Jayapura Regional Assembly vote. And in these demonstrations, activists took to the streets demanding one man, one vote, or democratic voting. And in doing so, they were getting their voices heard. They were expressing their desires as was entitled to them under the New York Agreement and just under basic human rights. After this demonstration was suppressed and many demonstrators arrested, uprisings began in Eneratoli and spread to Waget in May and June. In these uprisings, local policemen, with the help of the OPM, ejected all Indonesian school teachers, officials, and military, and raised the West Papuan Morning Star flag in their towns. They demanded the opportunity to vote in the act of free choice and asked for the vote to take place in these conditions, free from Indonesian intervention or coercion. The uprisings were eventually suppressed by the Indonesian military, but not before news of these uprisings spread around the world, forcing the UN administration to investigate the uprisings and for the first time actively seek out the West Papuans in the territory, incorporating their perspectives and views into the UN account. Diasporic activists supported these uprisings at the UN in New York by writing petitions explaining the events and also speaking to UN delegates about the suppression of West Papuan political rights. As a result of this lobbying, the UN representative in West Papua increasingly had to justify his dealings with Indonesia and the conduct of the Indonesian government. In this way, local and international campaigns supported and magnified one another. So when viewed through this lens, the highly politicized and controlled nature of the act of free choice becomes clear, and the vote is laid bare for what it is, an elaborately staged performance. Yet this framing also allows for West Papuan voices and actions to dominate rather than being a side story. So to play devil's advocate to my own work, what is the point of focusing on the West Papuan campaign for independence if their aims were never achieved? Well, I argue that while the West Papuans did not have the opportunity to express themselves in the act of free choice, their campaign was still highly effective at disrupting Indonesia's narratives about West Papua, drawing attention to the widespread political awareness across the territory and West Papuan opposition to Indonesian control. While Indonesia hoped to quietly conduct an act of free choice that would incorporate the territory into its republic and get rid of the United Nations, the formation of a transnational West Papuan independence campaign complicated this. Diasporic activists gained a lot of support at the UN, which generated considerable criticism towards Indonesia's approach to the act of free choice. While this outcome may seem inevitable now, at no point was it a given that the act of free choice would be accepted by the United Nations. While West Papuans were excluded from the voting, their experiences and perspectives are richly documented in other sources. And in fact, they curated their own archive during this time by using the United Nations. There are hundreds of West Papuan petitions sent to the UN over 1968 and 1969, and the reports on the West Papuans uprising staged across the territory in 1969 circulated around the world. Indonesia had to fight the UN to conduct the act in its restricted way using consultative decision-making, because West Papuan activists abroad had garnered so much support from African delegates at the UN that the UN administrator feared the vote would not be accepted by the General Assembly. Once the act was conducted, it was still a fight to get it through the UN General Assembly. The initial assembly session proposed for in October was delayed because African delegates wanted to properly study the report on the act of free choice and wanted to consult with West Papuan activists. Then in the United Nations General Assembly debate, UN delegates spoke up for the right of self-determination for West Papuans. While the act was meant to pass quickly through the UN, this debate spanned over a whole day, incorporating 2 sessions, and turned into a debate about the larger stakes of West Papuan self-determination. While the Assembly eventually conceded to taking note of the Act of Free Choice as fulfilling the New York Agreement, everyone in the room was aware of the West Papuan Nationalist Campaign. And in fact, members of the West Papuan Nationalist Campaign, including Nicholas Yahweh, actually sat in the General Assembly as part of an African delegation. The debate was significantly different than the 1962 session when the New York Agreement was debated. In this session, the debate had mainly focused around the New York Agreement as settling a dispute between Indonesia and the Netherlands, whereas instead the 1969 debate clearly acknowledged West Papuans as a competing party in the dispute over the territory. Yes, Indonesia still managed to have its way due to its resources, its willingness to resort to violence, and due to the geopolitical expediency of allowing Indonesia to retain possession of West Papua. But this movement of West Papuan activists made the world pay attention and marked their claim in this forum of international governance. So to conclude, studying the 1960s from the perspective of West Papuan people is important because it reframes the central event of this period as the formation of a transnational campaign for independence. This transnational network was important because it enabled West Papuans to have their voices heard by the United Nations and continue their campaign even while the territory was suppressed by the Indonesian government. This focus also draws attention to the ideas and strategies of West Papuan campaigners, highlighting their contribution to international debates and the impact of their resistance. It provides a richer history to the present day West Papuan campaign to the United Nations. So the story of the West Papuan campaign for independence is one of both resistance and resilience in the face of at times insurmountable challenges. It is also a story of decolonisation interrupted, of a claim never granted, a process never completed, and a vision unfulfilled. Yet this is an ongoing story, a campaign that exists to this day, as West Papuans around the world continue to lobby for West Papuan independence. The significance of the 1960s is not simply the signing of the New York Agreement or the outcome of the Act of Free Choice, but the ideas and networks that were developed by West Papuans during this time. So thank you. That's all from me today, and I'd love to hear your questions.